Awesome. So we've got a couple items on the agenda today. I guess first off, I just added a quick note about the explicit tests references and extensions. I think I've seen some people commenting on that in the PR. The idea there is that we have our substrate tests for functions to be like, oh, add has these behaviors and these options. We have the add defined in functions arithmetic. And in theory, there's an implicit link between, oh, if you go to functions arithmetic, if you go to the substrate core spec, under the test directory in functions arithmetic, you can find the test associated with it. But that's kind of an implicit link. And the idea behind this is to make it explicit so that tooling can do things like, this dialect has these extensions have these tests, run all the tests for the dialect that it claims to support. Kind of making those more machine discoverable and not just based on implicit kind of directory structures. And also the idea is that this will be useful for like extensions outside of the substrate org, in case those ever come to exist.
Hmm.
Yeah. That's the brief pitch.
My main thought was don't mix machine information with human information. That was my main thought. Is like, if we want there to be a directory of how these things relate to each other, I think a machine can generate it, and we should put it in. And if we want to put it someplace where people can look it up so that other tools don't have to build it, I'm more inclined to that, because I kind of feel like the function definitions are human defined.
Mm-hmm.
Or I think of them that way. It's like they're trying to be as brief as possible to allow people to define what needs to be defined there. Mm-hmm. So putting things there that could be, and that's true for the, I guess I would say the inside substrate test cases. It's hard to figure out a use case for external to substrate test cases, honestly.
External to substrate test cases.
Like you're saying, like you know, because you made it possible that you could put like a reference to a test case in a third-party repository.
Yes.
That seems weird. I mean, I could.
They wouldn't be part of the core spec. This would be like, oh, Data Fusion has a bunch of functions that are specific to Data Fusion that we want to have extensions Data Fusion, and we want to have tests for them that live in Data Fusion, for example.
But the tests should be with the Data Fusion definitions.
Yeah, so the function definitions would also be over there. So the function definitions, like,
I guess to your point, we could make it implicit that like if you have tests in your thing, just specify either verbally or in documentation, like where are the tests for your thing, and that's also reasonable. Like we could definitely do that in, like, one thing about the core spec right now is we have the test, but we don't actually say that there's nothing in the written doc to be like, hey, the tests for functions arithmetic are in these directories. Actually, the machine readable thing, the other part about it, I think, is actually having the link to the tests in the extension. I think is actually kind of useful from a user perspective to be like, oh, here's a bunch of functions, and also it turns out there's actually tests for these and they're linked explicitly, so I can go discover them. Versus having, like, I actually think it helps human discoverability as well. And I don't think it's that verbose relative to like the rest of the extension file. Like, we're not including the tests themselves. It's just like in the examples we've shown, what it is to have the whole directory linking is just be like, here's a directory, go read it, and inside of it are a bunch of tests that you can look at.
Yeah,
I would be more supportive of a situation where it's like test. Like, to me, it's a maintenance burden. To me, if you want discoverability, put the test next to the functions. Like, that people could see, like, oh, there's the, whatever functions dot, binary boolean dot YAML, and then next to it is like boolean tests dot YAML. Like, I'd be more inclined to do that.
Implicitly document, the expectation is that you put tests next to your YAML definitions.
Yeah. I mean, I'd be more inclined to do that, because then, I mean, that seems more maintainable, and you don't have, because to me, the thing is that the moment you create hard links inside of these docs, then it's like, okay, well now I've got to keep track of these hard links. It's just like, I don't know, like,
I mean,
and then like a test might
put hard links,
like,
then we have to communicate that they're implicit soft links that you can use. Like,
yeah, but I mean, like, if you think about code, right? Like 99% of code doesn't have hard links. You don't write the implementation for something and then in the implementation point to the test file. Right? We never do that in source code.
Import statements all over the place.
I have never seen an import statement in an implementation pointing at the test code. I've seen the opposite.
Yeah. No, I just mean code points at other code. Tests point at code. Things point at things.
Something that might maybe merge the two worlds would be to have yet another file thing, which is extensions and then pointers to the test that's not in the extensions, that's not in the test, but it's a secret third thing.
Well, that's what I had in the dialect. I mean, originally I had the tests in the dialect file, right?
Yeah. And the reason we get
mostly so that they could have a snapshot of here are all the test files and their versions or whatever, and here are all that are applicable for this dialect at this particular point in time.
And the reason I think
I feel like that's serving a different purpose. Tell me I'm wrong. I feel like has a different purpose. Like being able to state that like something like this dialect. I mean, this dialect's passed. All these tests pass on this dialect. I guess is what you're saying.
Well, not necessarily pass, but these are the ones that were defined at this particular point in time. So new ones come in and it doesn't pass or wouldn't pass or changes the behavior or whatever, or just new functions with new tests. All that stuff.
But it seems like it would need to be passed. Like having it list a test that in the dialect that doesn't pass. I mean, I didn't see the original patch, so I don't know if you separate it was not.
Yeah, I mean, it was like, okay, I have Spark 3.5.1 dialect, and in 3.52 they make a fix for some function. You have the list of tests that were there for 3.5.1, and then you have the new ones that are appropriate for 3.5.2, which may still be the same files, but they're at a different point in time.
Like the reason I recommend that we pull the tests out of the dialects though like that is that for me that's like a different maintenance burden. We're like, cool, we're gonna have a data fusion dialect, .db dialect, Isthmus dialect, Snowflake dialect, each of which point to tests. So if we ever update tests or add tests, we have to go through like, you know, our N+1 dialects and update all the references to be like, oh, we added a new test to absolute because we found an edge case that wasn't handled in some cases. We want to like have to manually go update all the dialects for them.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with that perspective. Yeah, I mean, I don't have. I don't know. I'm gonna. Maybe some other people can talk. Like I'm generally not excited about this, but I'm not gonna block it. But
that makes sense.
We could also start with it being soft, implicit, and make it hard later if we really, really need to.
I think that's reasonable. I think we could do that. I don't think this is in blocking. And I think that the thing I'd probably have to, I can update my PR to be like, hey, the tests for the core functions are in the directories and the association is this. As long as it's written down somewhere that we can be like, here's what the schema is. That seems reasonable.
what do people think about putting the tests next to the?
I actually don't like that because if you look at how many test files we have, like that directory of extensions now becomes, because there's one test file per function.
As opposed to one file per class of functions.
Yeah. But also one file per function, well, one file per extension would also be like, here's a test file, like that's 1,000 lines. It is also a problem. But it's like, yeah, for example, arithmetic, there are like 30 arithmetic tests alone for different functions. So we'd have like extensions alongside. At that point, it's almost impossible to find the extensions within the test files.
Yeah, not fair.
Every language does something completely different with like where they put tests, and trying to find a true answer is somewhat pointless. So whoever happens to implement it, I would just improve whatever they do.
To Jack's point, though, I'm okay with making it an implicit soft link for now, and then if it does cause problems, or once we start getting into like people want to do stuff outside, we can revisit the problem. I don't think it's a huge blocker. Cool. Yeah, I'll just talk about the decision and then move on. Guys, there's just to follow. I think is the dialect discussion. I think that's ongoing. I don't know if we need to talk about it in the chat, given that I've seen people commenting on the PR, but just was gonna put as an agenda item because anyone had something they wanted to say now.
I think the one thing I will say is I've been thinking a lot about gluten. This will relate. Sounds like it doesn't, but it will. And so for those that didn't see it, I put a comment on the ticket because some of the structures were simple, and I would expect that they would need to become more complex. So for example, saying you support join is probably not rich enough for most situations. You really need to say, I support these versions of join and not these versions, and this is allowed, but that isn't, or whatever, right? Like this join doesn't support inequalities or whatever. And so the original representation is simple and clean and easy to understand, which is basically like it's a list of strings, and you say, okay, I support join and project and filter, right? And in many ways, that's something that's much more achievable for people to do, right? Whereas a complex, rich, multi-layered representation is burdensome and creates friction and makes people be like, oh, this is hard. And I think that part of what we've seen with gluten and gluten's fork of Substrate is exactly that, which is that when we create friction, people bounce. They bounce off of it and go do it their own way. And so anyway, so that's what I brought up. I brought up like, hey, this seems like it needs to be more rich on the ticket, but I'm also like one of the comments I made is that maybe we make it a one of, and it can be a string or it can be a rich representation, and our initial examples of the strings, so that people can get started and feel like it's simple, and then later when they need to become rich, they can then use the alternative branch of the one of, which is the object with all the preference. And I just kind of want to bring up that sort of like tension, because I think we've seen real world examples, right? Like gluten now is being used in multiple platforms. It's used in Google, it's used in Microsoft. And it's painful to me that it's using a fork of Substrate. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I wanted to just bring up that.
I do actually like that idea of just having the string version to be like, cool, if you claim to support all joins and you don't care to say join, but if you actually have specifics, then use the join object and just have it written down that if you declare both, then you use the more specific one.
So the way that it ended up, I mean, I made all that changes last night. So
I didn't see it. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, originally it had a subtype, which allowed you to say, oh, I just want left and right joins. But I instead of having the separate subtype now, you have everything is an object. So instead of saying join, you have to say relation : join, which is not that much more burdensome. And then if you want to, then you provide the additional detail like join types being left and right. So you can provide the subtypes explicitly, they're being checked, which is great. What's not so great is if you have a misspelling on one of these enums, the one of says, hey, this isn't a valid read type, read relation. Maybe it's a fetch relation, and then gives you an error message for fetch relations, and it gives you an error message for filter relations. And it's the one of is not necessarily great from that particular perspective, but One of those error messages it gives you is the one that you need to look at.
Are you using constant
Yes.
for the relation name?
And then the relation name. That's the approach that I ended up choosing.
So it's just a bad
I-
validator.
AJV or something, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying like, oh, you should use a different one. I'm just saying that like the schema is more specific than what the validators appreciate.
That's possible. Yeah, that's probably true. I there may be better ways of making this schema more flexible or less complaintive, but I think if that's possible, if there are better ways or better checks, then we can switch to those. But it works. It tells you the errors. It's the important part.
I mean, it sounds like we're discussing implementation details and not like whether we should do this or not. So I feel like we have broad agreement that dialects are a reasonable idea. I think the one thing I put on the PR that would be useful would be some written language on the website itself being like, hey, what are these dialect things and what are they for? But like, other than that, I think it's just details, and we can take a look at David's updates offline. Unless anyone has anything specific to continue right now.
I think that one other thing that I kind of just struggle with slightly is, and I think it's probably fine, but like the whole concept of like, is this an infix or a postfix, prefix, etc. Right? It's kind of weird. It makes perfect sense in the context of SQL, but if I'm trying to describe like pandas, or I don't know, I don't use pandas, so maybe it does make sense of pandas. But if you're using a pure data frame API, I would assume it doesn't make sense.
It's useful if you want to.
I don't use data frame APIs, so I'm asking.
So the purposes that I'm interested in is to do the translation from the dialect, from potentially a SQL dialect into a specific substrate subdialect, and then back into potentially into SQL. So being able to know how to reconstruct that SQL, which is why we have local name everywhere, is pretty useful.
Are they required?
No, I mean a lot of these things are optional. In fact, infix prefix is not required, and I think it defaults to like function.
Yeah, I think that makes sense to Jack's point, where like if I have like my data fusion dialect or like a Postgres dialect, it's like, yeah, these should have the SQL things on them because they're data fusion has a SQL dialect, Postgres does. But for pandas, I'm going to be like, don't put a SQL dialect on, don't put postfix or infix notation on that because it makes no sense for that. Like it might even make sense to have like categories to be like, here's like SQL and then like SQL options that are, because I think are they at the top level right now, David?
The notation is part of the function definitions. So when you say supported functions, you could put them in there for the supported functions.
Supported functions, and then
window functions, or all the other kinds of functions. And so you don't in a lot of the examples don't even have them.
Yeah. I'm just wondering whether it makes sense to like categorize them as like a something of like SQL to be like just SQL specific options that you only set if you care about SQL. To be like, hey, like otherwise if you're not generating SQL or reading SQL, ignore these. But if you are, you can use them. Am I making sense?
Yeah,
I mean, we try to.
I'll comment on the PR. I think it's a detail.
Yeah,
we're talking about minor things now, so I think we're good.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay. I was just trying to make sure that we're bringing, like, I think that there's two options actually. I think we're thinking about dialects as for engines, whether those are SQL engines or something else. I don't think we're saying that these are dialects just for SQL.
No, they're not SQL.
Even though we're using the word dialect, which feels more like a SQL thing. It's more like engine specification, right?
Yeah.
Fair. And it may actually make sense to think about whether that name should change. But yeah, I think that's the two things. Is like, is this for engine specification or is this for SQL dialect? If it's for engine specification, then let's just be cognizant that like there are certain parts of it that won't make sense for certain kinds of engines, certain classes of engine.
Yeah, I think like I think David and I sort of we were working on the same things and we merged it. I was calling these consumer catalogs before switching to dialects. That was what was existing. So I think of these as like the consumer is specifying the things it supports, and it's not so much a dialect. But for me, like the dialect stuff is very consumer driven. It's not producer driven. Or like I as an engine or system, I'm declaring the things that I support. Here's my catalog.
I think early on I called it capabilities.
Yeah, consumer capabilities would also be like
Yeah, we already
No,
have.
consumer. I like specific like consumer capabilities. I'm not arguing for my word. I'm just like
I had the
like,
same thought about dialect where like I think the first time I saw it in like Substrate Go, I was like, why do we have SQL dialects in here?
Yeah, it came from the original tests, right? Like the original test framework that Rich put together. I think is called it dialects. I think that's where it all came from.
There's actually to understand the lineage. The dialect stuff came from BFT declared tests and dialects. We pulled the tests into the core repo, and now this is also deployed the dialect work in BFT into. Well, I guess the dialect work in BFT got pulled into Substrate Go, and now it's being pulled into the core repo, or specified in the core repo.
Yeah.
Well, the dialects consumption was pulled into Substrate Go, not the actual implementation of dialects.
Okay.
Like it was just like, hey, if you want to read a BFT dialect in Substrate Go, you should be able to.
Okay, so it was a BFT dialect. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, and so now it's getting a real specification.
Yeah, now it's actually getting the scrutiny by Substrate and not Fortran.
Yeah.
Cool.
Just one thing. I find the whole schema is very much, there's a very high correlation to the actual protobuf message. So last night I was like seeing this, like, is there like, can we actually generate these things from the protobuf? There are like certain things, like for instance, this I don't know, like capability, let's say the notation part, which is on parsing option. That's the term that used to me, familiar with me. So these things, I don't know, like could be, yeah.
Like the local name, right? That's not really correlated.
Yes, yeah. Local name is not.
There's some stuff that's like there's some stuff that's like is mapping, and some stuff is like listing, right? Like I support these 6 things, and this thing maps to this thing, right? So I do think that there are 2 different purposes, if you will. I think a lot of the stuff is listing, and I could argue that the listing stuff I have thought about it when we were looking at it earlier, whether or not it could be more directly correlated to protobuf. Like for this field is supported, this field is not. Right? Like so fields 14, 18, and 22 of the protobuf object are supported. And for field 22, we only support this subset of the enums that are available.
Something like that,
Yeah, I could see something much more machine oriented for supports. The mapping stuff feels like, and the function stuff in general, right? Because the functions are not like the functions are not enumerated in protobuf.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, whatever the hierarchy and the basically all the protobuf
support for types, relations, those kinds of things.
Right. Yeah. And also like this notation, particularly, this is like a different layer of substrate. This is more of you are unparsing the scalar expressions into certain language dialect. It could be SQLs or pandas or Pythons and so on. So I don't know. Like this could be, if we just go for this like capability model, then this notation part can be outside. This can be like something else.
Yeah. You could do it as two pieces. I agree with you. Like there's the capability piece, and then there's the unparsing notation, whatever you want to call it. Piece.
Yeah.
I think that my guidance there is that I like where you're going. I think if you like most open source, it's like, and Weston made this joke earlier. I don't know if it was a joke, but he made this comment earlier that basically it's like, who's willing to put time against this? Right. So if we're willing to put a little time against this and collaborate with David and get to a model that sort of separates these things out better and has some pattern around that, I think that would be great.
Sure.
I don't want to like to me, like perfect the enemy of the good kind of thing. Like if this is as far as David can take it with his time, like I'd rather do it than wait until we had a perfect thing.
So sounds good. I mean, yeah, I just because another burden is essentially whenever we make a change in the substrate, we have to basically think through that. I mean, this thing, should we update the dialects and so on? Then that piece is become like completely manual process.
Field name changes are no longer backwards compatible. I mean, they haven't been backwards compatible because we claimed JavaScript or JSON compatibility.
That's also true. Yeah. That's also true.
Yeah. But no, it's like I actually think that there's an interesting meta topic here, which is protobuf. I don't know what the abstraction language, like, because I actually think that this relates to both the description of capabilities as well as, hey, could we have an alternative representation that is human consumable, that is that is automated, right?
That is something that we are actually recently thinking, because of there are so many frustrating things in the protobuf. So can we actually use this protobuf as a meta IDL and then compile it into like different serialization framework? So that's definitely another interesting topic. I don't know.
So the bottom 2/3 of the file, from 100 like 170 to 530, it could be automatically constructed from the protobuf. Because it's basically the types and subtypes. So all the relations, all the expressions, and the primary fields. So that definitely could be done there. And that way, when somebody adds a new subquery type, it's just automatically appears. That definitely could be done.
But I mean,
But that's basically if we just want to. We want to do that at some point.
I think this is one of those things we get to cut ourselves to kind of like, yes, the names in these fields are based on the names of protobuf. Right now it's manual. Here's a ticket for someone to automate it if you have a smart intern for the summer who's bored, or someone with free time can do it.
Yeah.
Summer of code sometime.
Yeah.
Okay.
I also discovered that apparently there's an embedded function expression that's not actually an expression, so you can't actually specify it's not connected up.
What?
You can have like a pickled Python function defined, and do some operation on it, but we don't actually. It's just sitting there in the middle of the proto, and it's not actually connected up at all.
Oh, okay.
The pickup function got merged. I didn't realize that.
I
remember had long arguments with people about like what the environment side of things.
What is it? Cool. I think this is the rabbit hole for some other day.
Yes,
it is. Youngfield's topic about
like all along there was a plan to have embedded functions and embedded relations. And there was some progress made early on embedded functions for Python, but it was like half done, I guess.
Cool. If anyone has anything more to say, I think we should move on to the next topic.
Yep.
Yeah. Does Youngful, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, so I wrote this issue to basically it's like high level what is need to be done for the type variations, and yeah, I mean it's just issues. It's no concrete design, but some of the ideas. So I don't know, like, so I think the first two things are basically regarding the function behavior.
Let's
So-
pause here for a second.
Yes.
I believe that you're the first person to read the stuff I wrote on type variation since I wrote it.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure. I mean, I don't think, Victor, have you spent any time on type variations?
No, but I was going to, and I was like, someone's written about this already or asked questions about it. Because this has come up in the comics for us for Arrow.
I think Weston probably read it at some point, but I mean, I don't think you've done anything with it.
No.
Mhm.
I don't think it's actively used. I don't think anyone. Okay, actually, Data Fusion was using it for weird things. I think we got rid of it, but oh no, you know what they use? They use type variations to be like uints versus signed versus unsigned integers, which is actually not what they should be
Which is
used
a
for.
violation of the purpose of it. Yeah.
Yes,
Mm.
it's like separate topic about whether we should add signed integers to the core spec. I think we need to, but yeah, I don't think anyone's using type variations correctly. I think they're underspecified.
Mhm. Yeah,
Which
it is.
is that away, right? Data Fusion doesn't do that anymore. Or
Let me check the consumer real quick. I can do that while we continue.
Youngchul, do you have an example type that doesn't match inherits or separate?
Doesn't match.
I feel like his point is not that it's not possible. It's that it's very difficult.
Mhm.
Because it's like separate like the same actual issue came up in the context of like functions that only work on non-nullable types. Like inside of real implementations engines, you can have situations where a subset of code will only work on non-nullable types. And then it just creates this complexity or like around all of the extra level of like, you've got 3 arguments and you've got versions of the functions that only work on non-nullable types discretely for each of the individual arguments. It just creates this like permutation explosion.
Mhm.
I don't think he's saying that it isn't possible. I think he's just saying that it's a pain in the ass. Is that right?
Yeah, precisely. Yeah.
Right, because you can always do separate and then just rewrite everything.
Mhm. Yeah, right
But,
there.
like,
Yeah.
What's a concrete case where you would want extends?
Well, but that is basically this Microsoft internal thing. So we have a case that like one consumer is trying to support this like currency type. It doesn't have, well, SQL Server has the currency type, but this engine doesn't have currency type, but we can reasonably approximate the currency type using the decimal by fixed point decimal. And then to match this, say, capability or like compatibility across the producer and consumer, what we found that like there's only one or two functions that are like behaving different compared to currency and the decimal. So okay, so decimal has like a lot of functions, then to use it properly, you essentially have to like replicate like everything. And then, but really the only difference is like 2 functions. So yeah, so it's not like really, I don't know, like ideal. So that's the toil that we experienced.
In that case, would you say those 2 functions are just not supported or have different behavior?
Well, that's a second question. That's second point. So even though we say use separate, like there's like no way to refer this like specialized version of the functions, because
That's the part that I think is actually like, I don't think that's true. Like
Okay.
to me, I actually think you can use separate. Like this is the maybe it's because I haven't looked at this and you've looked at it more recently and I'm misremembering something.
Mhm, mhm.
But if you have two functions, decimal add and currency add,
Mhm.
where decimal add accepts type variation 0 and 1, and currency add only accepts 1. It doesn't accept type variation 0, and it's separate, right?
Mhm.
In that scenario, the plan can bind to the separate function because the separate function has a separate identifier.
Like which
Like-
identifier? The function cannot.
The
identifier doesn't include any sort of like type variation today.
right. Well, so let me give you the simplest version of that, which is just create a separate function name.
Separate function name.
Yeah, because the type binding is the file, the name, and the types, like the short name types, right? That's the anchor, right? And so if you just do a separate function block for currency add, and then only define implementations inside of it that are separates, you can refer to those discretely, like directly.
So like redeclare functions with slightly different names for like something standard function underscore currency with currency like as a
Yeah, like you have decimal add, then just have currency add as a separate name. I agree that you can't express it if you put the implementations under the same name, right? If you have implementations for add and one of them is the currency add, there's no way to distinguish between the currency add and the decimal add.
Correct.
Even though one of them refers to it by a different type variation.
Mm-hmm.
Like that, we don't have a way to do that because the pointers don't have variation in them, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you use a separate name, even the same name in a separate YAML file, right? Then you can refer to that alternative implementation.
But wouldn't you still want in that case to say that decimal add cannot be used for the currency type?
I'm not sure that he's expressing a need to define how things should be bound. He just wants to be able to define the binding. Are you trying to define the semantics in the function the binding semantics in the functions, like that, like what can be bound with what? Or are you simply trying to express that the plan is binding to this function? Does that make sense?
So yeah, I just want these things to be more closer to how this OP works. So let's say I want like type variation as a essentially subtracing and then override a few methods that specialize things. So yes.
Yeah, so because the system has support for decimal add, you just don't want to bind to it for when you know it's a currency add.
Sure.
And
I think
we state the problem. I just don't really understand it. With inherit and support, inherit basically says this type variation, every function that supports the parent type supports the type variation. So that's inherits.
Mm-hmm.
Separate is you have to redeclare a function specifically for that type variation. There's no reuse. And you want something where actually most of the functions we can reuse, except for these ones.
Mm-hmm.
That need to be a rebound.
Right.
Because yeah, I can see that being quite painful in the sense of you want to be able to reuse most of them except for some. And there's no way to declare that short of making them separate. Because you can't say, oh, you know what? I'm going to inherit, except I have to special case these ones in my producer and never use the built-in one.
Even like we bind it. I mean, let's say there are like two exceptions, and then we put them in give it a separate name or separate YAML file. And then I don't know, like is it really true? I don't know. Like it's so basically we need to distinguish that for this one when you produce the plan, oh yeah, this thing I need to know this thing is especially handled.
Well, so let me ask a question on that, right? Because it goes to something which has been an interesting thing. Right now, most engines do not look at function files to figure out how to bind.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
They bind the functions because they know about them. They don't inspect the YAML files at runtime and then figure out how to bind.
Yeah, they look at, and I think Calculate has it, or Substrate Job has an explicit map where it knows like this function name maps to this Calculate function. Data Fusion is a combination of like look up the operator name or the function name, and if they match, they're the same thing, which is not strictly accurate. But no one's actually inspecting the.
Yeah, so I mean, I see the utility in inherits because it is a more explicit. I honestly didn't read closely enough to think about how you're expressing that. But you're saying, hey, I want this function, let's call it currency add,
Mm-hmm.
to be decimal add. It inherits decimal add, but then has these implementations. And that basically means that for these implementations, they override, those implementations are used if they match, and if they do not match, the original implementations are used.
Yeah.
Question about this though, because like my understanding is type variations are used for, we have one type that might have multiple physical representations. So for example, the one I'm thinking of is an arrow, you have like string view, and such and such. Are big decimals and currency really the same type? Because currency is not just a different physical representation. A big decimal has its own logic for rounding, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's like depending on the systems, right? So that's why we're trying to.
I think Victor, I think, is it a perfect match for type variation? No, but I don't think it's that far off. Like honestly, decimal and currency, I think on a lot of systems, those are the same physical type with just different logical layers on top.
I think it makes sense to broaden the definition of type variations. I'm just saying that, like, based on my understanding now, the way it's written, it's for physical representations, and currency is kind of borderline. I think it makes sense to like broaden it and to handle some of this use case. I think having to redeclare every function is painful if you just separate. There's this awkward middle ground, which I think does make sense to kind of think about. I don't know if I'd call it extends, but there's something there, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, inherits is the right word. Extends is actually right as well. Like, I'm not saying that one's better than the other. I'm just like,
yeah, but the inherit is essentially like it's inherits and separate those like two extreme. Inherits like you are just
no, I agree. I meant the word inherits, not our use of it.
It's like inherits with override is almost the thing.
Like it's like all versus separate. That's really what it is. And you want something in between, which is all but, all except.
Yeah, all except. Yes.
Yeah. I'm supportive of this. And I think it makes sense. I don't think you actually proposed a specific structure, but my inclination would be is the structure is that it's a separate function. Just to remind me, this is defined at the function implementation level, right? The inherits versus separate.
Inherits and separate is the type variation definition.
Yeah, defining the type.
It's on the type, it's not type, it's on the function.
No, it's on the type variation.
Yeah, it's on the type variation.
So it is a little weird to do like accepts, because then it's like, where do you list the functions that don't match? And like, what if other people add new functions and so on? But I mean,
there's not much in the YAML right now, which is one of the things I was trying to look at.
Yeah. So I think the model that I want to the picture that I had in mind was essentially in the YAML there. So you can declare the implementation with a specific type variation. So let's say if I have like decimal percent and then I have a special implementation of like add or sub, just declare that, express that like implementation. Okay, this is for this type variation, and so that there is that implementation is there. So that was what I had in mind in the picture. Mind.
Yeah, the
But
challenge.
I think you
there,
probably
though-
need to. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say the challenge is that the add function is not aware of the currency type today.
Right. That is why the previous in the issue there's a binding to specialized function. So we need to extend the syntax to actually refer, or the type expression in the YAML should support the type variation notation.
Right. Even if we had that, still, Substrait's add is not going to, like in that core Substrate function definition file, we don't want to reference Microsoft specific types or something like that.
Oh no, oh no.
Or any of the specific types.
Yeah, so this has to be something that can be done in your extension. You declare your type and you have your overrides in your extension that
Exactly.
can reference the core. But
Right.
yeah, okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Would you, and this goes back to, I think, Jacques, when you were talking about having a currency add as a different function, can we today even define a function applying to a specific variation? I don't think we can. Or maybe we
I think
can.
because I think we define the type that it binds to.
Right, but not the variation.
The variation is part of the type string. It's just option.
Okay.
I think it's zero by default, but it's elided unless it's not zero. But is it in the plan of the extension?
But that is another thing. So I don't know. Like the zero is default. Yes. Okay. One. What does it mean by one? In the YAML. Is it? I think the one, whatever that number is, actually should be coming from the extension anchor.
You're right. It should be an anchor because right now there's no anchor in the type variation in the YAML. There's like an
Right.
array, and you can't do
Yeah.
like if zero is stand default, then well, if you add something, zero still points to.
Right, but then like it becomes like context sensitive, right? So the YAML, whatever the definition, if you use just 0 and 1, then the meaning of the YAML or function definition is actually changing per query. Like whichever variation support you supply in the query plan, the semantic of the function is changing, right?
I wonder if it makes sense for type
I'm
variation.
I'm not following that comment.
So if you want to specify or specify the implementation of the function with the type variation or this like type expression,
Mhm.
you have this like square bracket with square bracket is supposed to distinguish the across like different type variation.
I think the thing you're saying, I think my expectation, and this maybe is not specified, is that the function should I would argue that the function file should refer to at most one or zero type variations. Sorry, type variation files, extensions. If you have a function file,
Mhm.
right, and a function file uses, say, user-defined types, you have to refer to those, right, in the
Right.
header,
Yeah,
import.
right.
I don't know what it's called,
Right.
but basically imports.
Yeah.
If you want to use a type variation,
Mhm.
I think you should have to refer to the type variation that you're using, the type variation YAML,
Exactly. Yes.
as an import.
Yes.
Okay. I think you should, at least for right now, to keep things simple, I'd be inclined to say, at least to keep the specification as it is, you can only import one type variation in a YAML. One type variation YAML into a function YAML.
Okay.
Okay.
Why that restriction?
Because otherwise we have to do a bunch of breaking changes. That's my main reason.
I think we might need to make a breaking change. What I don't know anyone who's using this as well as the other thing. They're using it correctly. Because like part of it is I think in the plans it makes sense for the type variations to be referenced by anchors, but I think in the function in the extension files it probably should be named.
Yeah.
Like, it should be like I have this
Right.
type, I have this, I have string variant, named variant with like string view, large UTF-8 string.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
they almost need to be named so they can be shared across the ecosystem as well.
I agree with that. So that's why
I'm not supportive of that because that means that you're then having a new way to do representation of type. I don't know. Like
I guess it is a new type, but we're saying that this new type is just like
no. I'm saying that like we have a structure now, which is string, optional brackets, optional question mark. With the other things too, right? You've got the angle brackets, you've got the square brackets, you got the question mark. That's the structure right now.
Yes.
So you're saying that we could put strings inside of the
Correct.
square brackets?
Yes.
All right.
I mean, I guess the alternative would be that we get rid of the square brackets and we say, you know what? We have currency, and in the type declaration we say actually type is in the type itself type is a variant of some parent type string. So like that's the terrible idea.
You're thinking about it if the things have names, right? Like you're thinking like string view, right?
Yes.
Like it doesn't work as well if you're like if it's like columnar integers versus row wise integers, like which honestly is I think that is the classic case for this. Is I've got row wise and columnar versions of the data.
Can we zoom out for 1 second since we only have 3 minutes left? Are we all in agreement that we want to support the basic idea that variations can be used or should be able to be used to specify new types that are almost the same as some other type with a few minor differences in semantics? And then like we could work out a PR from there and instead of doing details right now. So I think like if I were to look at this with a very critical lens, I would say currency is not even a variation. It's a, like Victor was saying, it's a user defined type. But I agree with Jacques, which is like there is a lot of tedium in saying to making a new user defined type, especially for something that behaves so similarly. But then that does open like a slippery slope. It's like, are unsigned integers similar enough to integers to be a variation, even though the semantics of almost every function would change subtly? Like, where do you draw the line between those two?
Yeah, I would rather keep them separate. If it's the columnar versus not, I mean, it's still column versus row. I think that those are essentially, I mean, that's still seems right for
their implementation details that have nothing to do with the user's like logical expectation of the data,
right? Or string versus string view, and it's probably still better for it to be in the square brackets, and so you'd have to say string square bracket string view. I think that's fine.
I think there might be room for we keep type variations as physical differentiations, but we extend the user defined type system to be like, you know what, like currency. When resolving functions use string, like effectively we can implement some kind of extends.
Yeah, I'm wondering the same thing, whether there's a fix someplace else.
Like make types richer. And then we can do things like, hey, let's have a numeric type. all the I8 and floats and all that inherit from that.
Well, I feel like what he's saying here is that I have a decimal type, which I call currency, which supports all of the decimal functions except these three. It has its own three, right? Like that's the logical definition of the problem, right? Yeah, I kind of feel like we should try to figure out if we should do an iteration on like type aliases. It's different from type variations. I'm using aliases. I'm not set on that term, but just like this is a type alias, which is mostly the same but a little different.
Well, that's
Carrots
not
for you.
alias. So.
So almost
yeah, no, that's
a
true. It's not
user
alias. I don't
defined.
know.
But it's like a user
an
defined
easier
type
user
within
defined
Harris.
syntax,
It is user-defined type, yes, yeah.
and
But
it's
again,
just syntactic sugar potentially.
correct, yeah. I mean, yes, another way is like just go completely with the user-defined type, and that's yeah, it's
Well, but I think one of the
effectively
things you're trying to avoid is like, hey, we are like here's the question, right? Is that how do I use existing functions on user-defined types? That's actually the question.
Mhm.
Maybe that's a question.
Like in my head, it becomes like, oh, the currency user-defined type is the parent of it is string. When the implicit behavior is anywhere that you see a function for currency, you can sub it for a function for string, or for whatever the parent, no, not string, sorry, the parent type is, and that's like cool. This is
Yeah,
the logical equivalence.
So yeah, that's precisely how basically whatever the bindings or resolution is. If you see the specialization, just use it. Otherwise, go follow the hierarchy.
Because then I also want to do the other way around now, which is cursed.
Yeah.
Only declare numeric functions and then have like, oh, I can add an I8 and I8, which would so to not have like 6 definitions per numeric function, except for decimal. That maybe it's its own thing. I'm not going to pull that into numeric.
I have a hard job. So I'm gonna head out.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think you've identified a gap. Joel, I think we should fix it. That'll
Okay.
be beyond the scope of this meeting, but
Yeah.
I think we're in agreement that we need to fix that. You have a valid use case that's works.
Some fix.
Yeah, I can stay a little bit late. I really want to ask. I want to ask Yamashiro a question because he said something, so I put it in the agenda as like, hey, I want to follow up on that. It wasn't the time at the moment, but you said and so you guys, if you want to drop, it's cool. I have enough time to stay on for a minute. You said what I heard you say was since protobuf is so difficult to work with, we're trying to think about whether or not there can be some other alternative representation that people work with, or it's so frustrating to work with, or something like that. Could you just talk a little bit more about that? Because that seems like an important statement.
Yeah. So basically, being in Microsoft SQL, dealing with the SQL Server code base, which is I don't know, like more than 30-year-old. It has like a lot of quirks, and it's having like all these like main. There's a Windows thing, and then also being written in 1990s, having like custom memory managements and all of these stuff doesn't really work well with this like modern C++ thing, where entire Google-based code is all into the modern C++. And
Yeah. The mono repo always moves forward.
Exactly. And then and so that gives like a lot of friction, especially if you're using native language, C++. There's lots and lots of quirk. So for instance, if you protobuf, it's actually very well-known fact. Protobuf relying on like std string and all this like standard data structure. As soon as you have a custom memory manager, it doesn't work. It's a royal pain to get.
So this is more about it's not about the APIs, it's about the technical environment constraints.
That's true. Yeah. If you're using like a managed environment like Java, C#, Go, Rust, maybe, it's not a big. Well, Rust there, I think I need to squint a little bit because there you can also have these kind of problems as well. yeah, so it's mainly C++ especially. It's a very painful for us. So that's why we are starting to exploring like thing. And there's another thing which is I raised this to the community some time ago that protobuf, the official protobuf C++ library has a recursion limit, and there's like only one way to programmatically work around that limit, which is not applied in Substrate C++. I have, that's always been like I want to submit the fix something like, but that's there. So and then there's so the main point is basically, especially with the C++, and Google is not like moving really fast with the evolution of the C++ library, and that's why we are trying to looking into some other different serialization framework. Yeah,
I'm curious whether or not you've looked at, because the protobuf JSON schema is strongly defined, right?
Mhm.
It's specified.
Yeah.
I'm curious whether you guys thought about just using that, just saying, you know what, we're gonna create like build a JSON schema that's a complete schema for the protobuf objects, and then use that as and then just use whatever libraries you normally use for working with JSON and JSON schemas. Would something like that relieve any of that? I don't know if you've thought about that.
That's an interesting option. I personally I have like no experience with this like JSON schema thing that you talked about. Yeah, but is it just so the JSON schema is expressing things in JSON, right? I guess.
Yeah, so JSON schema. So like if you think about, I don't know, are you familiar with OpenAPI at all?
Not
I'm assuming not. You're in the database internals, not on the application development side. I get it. Yeah. So in applications, like if you have a REST API, the standard way to define the JSON objects that are sent, posted to and returned from REST API is typically called OpenAPI or Swagger. Those are two different names for basically the same thing. I don't know exactly which one's the valid one now. And they use JSON schema. JSON schema basically specifies the shape of JSON objects that are allowed.
Actually, if you look at David's dialect proposal, he has a JSON schema for the dialect, is what that is.
Yeah, so it defines how the structure of the JSON dialect.
Got it. Yeah.
Protobuf defines a well-known, formally specified format for a JSON version of the protobuf objects. Okay, so you can go to and from protobuf to JSON and back with protobuf tools, and it's lossless and it's reliable. And we maintain that we maintain JSON compatibility. We consider JSON compatibility to be our bar, not binary compatibility, because protobuf binary compatibility is easier to maintain because you can change field names.
Right.
And as long as you don't change the numbers, protobuf maintains, but JSON changes because JSON uses the field names. So anyway, so we maintain that. And so you could take the protobuf IDLs and convert them into JSON schemas. And then typically in every language, there are a dozen different tools that will produce local language object bindings for that JSON schema. Because we do it with, everybody does it with REST APIs all the time. So there's all these tools that basically say, like, here's a JSON schema, build an object hierarchy in this language. And a lot of those tools have very, like there's typically ones that, like, it's all very stripped down. And there's other ones where it's like, oh, it uses a bunch of libraries and stuff like that, right? Yeah. And so I think I would suggest, if you haven't looked at it, look internally and say to the guys working on the SQL Server, if we had a JSON schema, do we have a standard way to take a JSON schema and convert that into something that will work well inside the SQL Server codebase as a collection of objects that you work with? Because that might be a way to do this where you're using mostly like prior art rather than having to build something custom.
I guess actually taking a step back, like, what would be your ideal, like exchange format if it wasn't protobuf?
There's like no
XML.
ideal format. As long as something that can doesn't have any say static initializer and doesn't have, I mean, there's a way to plug a custom memory manager and also support like zero copy. And it can be ideal.
A better question here is that, like, so, you know, the Substrate spec is technically a combination of the website and the protobuf spec. The protobuf spec is just like a primary serialization format. It doesn't necessarily mean it has to be the only serialization format that we ever have. It ends up being more support to have multiple ones that we need to update.
Yeah.
In theory, this, like, the spec should be on the website first, and the protobuf is like a reflection of the website.
Is an implementation of the spec.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like this, I had a similar thing that was triggered by Young's comment, which is like, we have a bunch of grammars for like the type variation stuff and the function tests, which are like Antler grammars.
Yeah.
But not every language has an Antler runtime. So it's almost like we've been thinking about, like, should we have like EBNF grammars for those things? And then the Antler grammar is like the reference parser, but you can do other ones.
Yeah.
Like similar to like protobuf is maybe like the most supported serialization format we have, but should it be the only one?
Yeah, so that's I think like at some point, like I don't know, like I internally, like Jesus and I was like brainstorming about this, and and this thing actually, the precisely what you described, like it's Substrate being a meta spec essentially, and then there's like multiple serialization framework like automatically generate the bindings from that meta spec.
You can read the protobuf definitions and do a lot of things.
Exactly.
Like in the text plan stuff I'm working on, I read in the protobuf and then I generate generate a visitor for the entire proto based on all that.
That's exactly the idea. So if protobuf is essentially we just represent whatever the spec in terms of the protobuf as an ideal, and then transpile this into whatever ideal that each serialization framework support, and then you can just generate binding. By the way, some of these alternative that link in David you sent, we are actually looking into those things. So that's
okay. I just, when you said that, I was like, I wanted to, the main question I had was a clarification of whether or not it's a technical constraint or an API problem. And it seems like it's a technical problem as opposed to like people don't like working with the API protobuf.
If you, the environment that we are in is not very friendly.
It's constrained.
Yes,
it's constrained in a way that is largely incompatible with the way the protobuf code is generated.
Exactly. Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks to everybody.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. Good seeing y'all.
Thank you.
Lots of things to do.
Yeah.
See y'all.
Bye.